Hi, I'm the Warrior Witch, and you can call me Nike. Today we've got a very fun episode, and it's going to be all about deity work with a special guest, Chaotic Witch Hunt. I've known Frankie for a little while now. I first saw her on TikTok, and she has since expanded onto other social media platforms like Instagram and YouTube, and she's super cool and fun, and she has made a lot of deity work style content, and I know that she's done deity work for many, many years, so I thought she'd be a great person to have on to talk with me about sort of the ins and outs of it, what it looks like daily, is it for beginners, etc., plus some misconceptions that we're going to go through. So, Frankie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Frankie, aka Chaotic Witch Hunt, on multiple platforms. I've been practicing Eclectic Witch for 6 or 7 years, I want to say. I'm losing track of time. And I have been doing deity work for about 5 or 6 years. And from there, I started looking into folk magic, saint magic, that's where I am right now, and I am also a medium, so that adds a nice extra layer of fuckery when it comes to deity work.
Some flavor.
Some flavor. It makes them spicy.
Spicy. So we're gonna kind of just jump right into it. So how did you start, not just with like paganism in general, but like specifically with deity work? How did you really get into that in the first place?
So getting into deity work kind of started at the beginning of my witchcraft journey, which I know I spout like deity work not for beginners, but I didn't necessarily start deity work then. I started deity worship then. And I started it when I started receiving animal symbols and animal messages, because they were highly associated with, like, the idea of the horned god, or Kronos, as I call him. I was seeing deer, I was seeing foxes, I was seeing blue jays, and I slowly have coined these as my animal messengers. But I think it also contributes to a lot of the books that I started with were Wiccan. And deity work was very, very prominent in those texts, talking about the god and the goddess. And that's kind of how I familiarized myself with it. And from there, I kind of started my research into other pantheons. And I didn't start my intense deity work till like a little bit later with like Floya and Nath, and all my other kind of patron entities didn't come in until later. Nath is the newest one. She's androgynous, so sometimes I use they with her. She's been around for, I want to say, like, a year, maybe half a year. Whereas Floya and Kronos have been around for a little bit longer. Is that good? Do you want me to add on to that in any way?
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
That's interesting too, because I actually also started with Wicca. I was dating a girl in high school who was a Wiccan, and that sort of introduced me to it. And so it feels weird to say, but like I was a Wiccan for a little while, but it just didn't really click. But that also was sort of my introduction to deity work. And I met you, I discovered you on TikTok when you were really heavily working with like Freya, and sort of getting through, like, she was helping you work through that toxic relationship shit. And yeah, so a very, very like similar path of like Wicca introduces it. I think that's sort of the way for a lot of people too. That's interesting. And I'd love to cover very briefly sort of the difference between work and worship, because I think that distinction is probably going to pop up a lot in this conversation. So how would you sort of differentiate the two?
I would consider worship to be more of a, the best way I can describe it is like they're a tier above you and you're a tier below, and you are offering them things and kind of looking up to them, which that respect that you have in that relationship should never change as you move into deity work. But deity work becomes more of a working relationship. You are more it's more of a give and a take. I refer to it a lot of the time as symbiotic. I've heard people argue that they'll never do deity work because it's basically paying a deity to pay attention to you, but I don't necessarily see it that way. I don't see it as like they're only gonna work with you when you give them things. They're there consistently in this relationship. It's only if you really kind of clock out that they stop that work.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I try to put it like the difference of worship versus work is kind of like your boss telling you what to do being like the worship where they're a step above you and they're removed. You're not doing anything directly with them. They're just like, this is what you should be doing. So you do your job because you know your boss wants you to do that, versus sort of like working side by side with your manager on a project. So you're like in the office together, you're collaborating, and they are still like in charge of you, but you are actively able to have that back and forth of like, what about this? Well, what about this? Sort of with them, you know?
Yeah, I completely agree. And
I don't know if that'll make sense to other people.
Total sense. I think that I've gotten a lot of arguments with people too, where they're like, well, like Greek children used to worship deities without any protection. And I'm like, yeah, that's normal. Worshipping something, like when we think of Christians too, they're basically worshiping a god with no protection. So worshipping isn't something that is inherently dangerous or bad. It's something very normal to human society and has been present in human society for a very long period. And then when we talk about deity work, that's more along the lines of really kind of getting into paganism and communing with the divine in a more personal and intimate way. And the reason I usually say deity work isn't for beginners is because it can get hard and difficult a lot of the time.
Yeah, it definitely requires like a lot more effort, a lot more time. I know that from my personal experience, I've straight up just had deities like peace out and leave because I wasn't dedicating enough time, or because I couldn't dedicate enough time because, you know, like school and work and everything. And if I just sort of fell out of the deity work habit, they were just like, all right, guess you're not serious about it. Come back another time. Bye.
I think that's really accurate. I've had people, I've heard, I've never had a deity leave. Actually, that's not true. I have had deities leave, not on because I wasn't paying attention, but because the time for path work was up. And the deities I work with now are exclusively patrons, which means they're not going anywhere. They've kind of always been here and always will be here for the rest of my life. Even if I don't, like, continue to work with them, they'll still kind of be there. I'll probably still worship them. But I think it's interesting because a lot of people don't... I don't know, there was this trivializing of deity work on Witch Talk that I was very present to, and it kind of even, like, sucked me in, this idea that, like, this, what's the word for making anthropomorphizing of deities.
Yeah.
In kind of everyday life.
Yeah, that, like, going out to get coffee with your deity stuff.
I definitely excuse that behavior at the beginning because, like, I didn't know better. And, like, even though my experiences with my deities weren't like that at all, I felt like it was bad of me to say and invalidate other people's experiences. Which I still stand by that. I don't think I should say, oh, this never happened because I've never had something like that happen with my deities, but it made and paved the way for a bigger trend of treating deities like friends. And
yeah.
That is in turn why I cycled on to deity work isn't for beginners, which, like, speaking in technical terms, that's not necessarily true. The reason I say that is because I would rather someone hear that and be like, okay, I'm going to put an extra year of research in and do this the safe way, than me saying you can definitely do deity work as a beginner and hopping into it with no safety net and no understanding of it. Because deity work is, you know, very research-based. It's a lot of devotion. It's a lot of time. And the amount of times I've heard people be like, oh, I have a crush on my deity. Or like, oh, I'm doing this with my deity. I have like 12 of them. Like, things that are very... your face. Very much...
I hate that stuff. Like, dating your deity makes me really mad.
It's just, I mean... And one of the people who told me that was 13. So, of course, I'm gonna...
Oh, yeah, they often are. It's... And that's unfortunate because it ends up... I'm not gonna, like, blame TikTok because, like, you and I both know this is a thing that happened long before TikTok was a thing. Tumblr was a whole dating your deity realm. That was a whole fun time. But I found that it's much more a sort of teenage, like, 13, 14-year-old thing when you're just starting to get into the concept of, like, what dating is, and you're just starting to think about, like, boyfriends and girlfriends and partners. And then you also mix paganism into it, and you hear about this, like, intimate connection. And in part, you get, like, media, books, TV comics, whatever, sort of influencing that thing of like, and then it like mixes with mythological literalism, which we've covered on OWASP before, where people think, well, there's myths about Zeus coming down and he romanticized a mortal and he slept with her and they had a baby and they lived happily ever after. And all of the rest of like serious pagans who've done their research and understand that myths are not meant to be literal are like, no, like we, in regular society, we rail against Christians who take the Bible super literally as like, it's only this many days old, there was literally a flood, this literally happened. Like we talk about biblical literalism and how that's dumb, but then immediately apply it and make it mythological literalism. It's just never clicked. And so I think it's so often these 13-year-olds saying I'm dating my deity, and it's like, number one, that's not how that works. So number two, you're either making that up and LARPing, or part of why that, like, this leads into more of why it's not for beginners. Number two, it could be an entity that's not a deity trying to take advantage of you.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen people who are identify as polytheists or pagans, not witches, be like, no, deity work is definitely something you can do as a beginner. Witch talk is bullshit and full of, like, misinformation, which I understand, having that response, I do, but at the same time, if you didn't see the kind of way that deity work was being presented and used on Witch Talk, and then that was a direct kind of, maybe don't do that, and then just start saying like, yeah, no, let's not do this, I'm gonna put this barrier up, if you're really serious about it, we can reconsider this conversation. But saying deity work isn't for beginners was a direct kind of response to the trivializing and dangers that were surfacing on Witch Talk and kind of people doing it irresponsibly. And not all of them were beginners. Like, I'm not going to pin it just on novice witches. Like, there were other witches that were doing things that were like, And from there, I kind of went from like, okay, I'm just going to start putting entertainment only and dramatization on my deity videos, because there were dramatizations, there were skits based on my interpretation of divine energy. And I'm not afraid to admit that. I'm not afraid to admit that most of my spirit interactions are dramatized, because that's what makes it fun, and that's, entertainment. But it's not that exciting in real life. You just kind of have things show up and you're like, aha, oh, hi. And even then, I mean, I've talked to... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I think that's one of the big things, is that people think it's gonna be this like big exciting thing, and it's gonna be like they descend into your room as a ball of light and you'll hear their voice booming in your ears, and it'll be this amazing crazy experience, or you'll dream of them every night. Like, it's usually not that intense, and if it is, it's rarer, and if it's going to be that level of intense, usually it's because you've like worked really hard on your abilities and you've made it so that like any dream work you do, you can sort of actively channel that to decide when you want to like ask them to enter your dreams, or you've been able to tune into those energies more. If you're a novice, most likely you're not going to have that sort of strength and abilities to be able to just do that at will, or to feel it that easily. Your experiences are more often going to be mundane things that you're mistaking for deity stuff. I on one of our podcasts we did, I basically said like, are you getting signs from Odin, or is it just a bunch of crows in your area or a bunch of ravens in your area? Like, if you see 3 ravens sitting on top of a dumpster, does that mean Odin wants you to dumpster dive? No, it just means that there's ravens and there's scavengers and they pick through the trash. Like, you have to be able to discern what's the difference between animals doing things that animals do versus a sign from a deity. Now, if those 3 ravens then just hopped their way on the sidewalk following you home and you had no food on you, and then they just sat outside your door and stared at you for 3 days, maybe that would be a sign. But just 3 ravens or 3 crows on a dumpster, please don't go dumpster diving.
My go-to is like animals behaving strangely. Not just animals showing up, but animals behaving strangely. And one of my weird things was like, I remember the first animal sign I ever saw was a blue jay. And I had never seen a blue jay in my life. Even though they're in my area, they always stayed high in the trees. I asked for a sign from the universe and it came down and landed right in front of me. And I was like, I've never seen you before, and I've lived here for 16 years. And then I saw more, and then it just was like, I asked for a sign, and then suddenly I was seeing this bird that I had never seen before, and just in front of me, even though they aren't supposed to come down to the ground often. And the other one was just...
Yeah, and they don't like people, so the likelihood of them, like, avoiding you is going to be much higher than, like, why would a bird choose to come down and land in front of a human? It's really, especially in a city, really rare.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other thing, too, is, like, I've had a lot of really great conversations with beginners or novices who are really interested in this stuff and are definitely, like, feeling the presence of a divine energy pulling them to deity work, and they're doing all the research and they're really serious about it. And then I've heard people who are, like, started in 6 days are like, I saw this and I feel like Artemis is calling out to me. And I'm like, okay, so there's a difference between starting your craft and feeling like deity work is something that you're interested in long term, and starting your craft and seeing a deer and being like, Artemis! And I'm like, so I always kind of say, like, listen, deity work isn't for beginners, and these are the reasons why. It's not because it's dangerous. It's because if you're calling in an energy, you need to know how to get rid of it if it's not what you want it. Not what you want it to be. And at the same time and same vein, understanding how much work it is. Like, it is, you know... things will happen at a deity's hands, which are always for the better. And if you are a novice and you are ready for that, that's fantastic. But I know novices who are 15, 16 years old, and I know that if a deity, you know, did the same things that they did to me for my betterment, it would fuck your shit up. Like, it would ruin your life to a certain extent in 15, 16-year-old terms. And so there is that kind of perspective of getting older and seeing these things and being able to see them as like, okay, this was for the better, versus I know how teenagers' brains work because I was a teenager, and seeing it as like the world ending and like an awful thing happening. And it's really difficult to see that perspective the younger you are.
Yeah, definitely. The sort of hands-on approach that deity work ends up taking is often... You know, when you're a teenager, you're starting to sort of vie for that control of your own life. You're trying to be more independent, and you might think that it'd be fun to have like a buddy of your deity, or like somebody who will give you help whenever you want. But the reality is that they're gonna, in some senses, try to change the course of your life, because the big thing that I think novices don't understand is that it's not that you're asking a deity for help and they're gonna do what you ask of them or just not do it. It's that they have their own things that they want, and if you're saying yes, I'll work with you, that means they're going to ask you to do stuff. It's not just that you get to ask them. They will ask you, and they will move your life and change things around in very specific ways, and you might not like that if you're not ready for it. If you're not ready for somebody to sort of dip their hands into your life and change things, it's not for you. I mean, the lightest examples I can think of is like I'm gonna go with specifically Freya here, but like Freya or you know, like maybe Hera or something, if you're in a toxic relationship but you don't want to leave yet, or you're not ready to leave yet, they'll force you to break up. They'll make something happen, like the toxic boyfriend's family has to leave suddenly, and so he moves across the country because she's like, no, it's time. He's gotta go. You got shit to do. I don't want you with him because he's fucking shit up, and I don't like this. You know, they might force the... Oh, did I just say something? Oh, no. I didn't know any information. Frankie, did this literally happen to you? Did he move across the country?
Oh, no. I found out he was seeing someone behind my back. And he was on Tinder and lied to me a couple times. And I remember starting, like, I was working with Freya, and Freya called Artemis in. And then Artemis was like, yeah, so he's cheating on you. And, like, I remember her coming in and absolutely knowing that it was, like, because this relationship had been drawn out and was stopping my spiritual progress, and my goddesses were like, yeah, no, fuck this shit. Let's get rid of it. And...
he's in the way.
I'm like, they're like, he's in the way, so we're gonna make this happen. And I mean, I was in that relationship for on and off for 2 years, and it was very clear I didn't have the strength to leave, so they did it for me. And I was like, And like, yeah, in the moment, it sucked. And it was like 6 months of pain and really awful stuff and like working through it. But at the same time, you know, on the other half of it, it was clearly for the better. But, you know, it sucked.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, because I've been in a really shit relationship too, and it ended against my will, not because of Deity Work or anything. I just wasn't the one to break it off, surprisingly. But, you know, I can recognize now, like, looking back over those years, it was a really shitty relationship literally from the beginning, but I didn't have the self-confidence to recognize what it was, and so even when it's not through magical means, like, you might from the outside be like, well, you know, they got you out of a toxic relationship, isn't that good? And if you haven't been in it, you won't realize it. For those who have been, you'll know what I'm talking about. You're not ready to leave, you don't want to leave, so it hurts, and you know, you cry for a long time, you don't understand why it's happened, and you like in some ways want them back, and if you're not ready for that, like that's kind of the stuff that might happen with Deity Work, is those kinds of feelings that get brought up with like toxic relationships having to end, and you're not ready for them emotionally, you don't have the strength to yet, and you might even get like mad at that deity if the deity is the one who like made that push happen. You might get really upset, but their hands are in your life now, and if you're not ready for somebody else to take that control and force you out of something that, you know, isn't good for you, it could be a job, a living situation, a relationship, lots of stuff, things will just change, and it might look to you as if they're going wrong. And the reality is they had to end in order for things to happen. Like, I had to leave that toxic relationship, both like romantically and then post, we're trying to be friends or whatever, but like I had to detach from that in order to find my self-confidence. I had to be able to recognize it for what it was, and that helped me help other people out of toxic relationships. Or to see toxic patterns and then fix them. Or, you know, I wouldn't have been able to like be with the partner I'm with now. I wouldn't be in school. I don't even know that I'd be doing this because that relationship really stunted my like spiritual growth, and I wasn't free to explore any of this because it was mocked routinely. Like, not even about what I was doing, just the concepts in general were mocked. And so I didn't have really any like confidence and freedom. And so it was important to leave, but man, it really, really sucks. And if you don't want somebody to force you out for the better of it, you're not gonna like Deity Work.
I think the thing is, too, is I've noticed as I kind of have moved and become bigger on witch talk and all this other stuff, is that there are gonna be people who don't listen. Like, I can tell you that it's gonna happen 100 times, and you will still be like, this is what I want to do. And if that's, you know, your prerogative, that's fine. I just ask that you do it safely. If you really want to do deity work as a beginner and there's nothing I can say to stop you, then okay, which is part of the reason why I like to provide, like, here's the way to do it best and the safe way of going about it.
The other part of, like, why it's not for beginners necessarily that I think is important to touch on more, because I just, like, briefly mentioned it earlier, but we should talk about entities masquerading as deities and, like, that being part of that not for beginners discussion.
Yeah, I think a lot of people argue that it's really hard to get a trickster spirit, but like, let's be honest, if you're going into it as a novice with not a lot of understanding of what entities feel like or what certain entities behave as, and you don't know the difference between a divine entity and a negative entity, and that's like, you know, that's okay. But part of the reason we say, like, is like maybe have like a year or two experience under your belt is because if you're you don't understand you don't know how to feel the difference between what like a parasitic entity or a deity feels like if you're just kind of hopping off the bat. And that was me when I started, and it was like I was like 6 months in, no protection on my house, trying to communicate with a deity, and I didn't really get a deity. And it turns out I was like, it's Bast, and it wasn't Bast. It was Freya reaching out to me earlier in my like practice, but then I didn't really get either of them, and it was like a year of me being at college and my family hearing people move around in my room. Just kind of lingering. And that's kind of why I always say, okay, maybe like take a year or like 6 months to research before kind of just like diving in. And I say that because it's like, it can, like, parasitic entities are like, if it shows up and you banish it, it's okay. If it shows up and it attaches to you, and then it becomes a lot more difficult to get rid of.
Yeah, definitely. Like trickster spirits, negative spirits, parasitic entities, like they can all very much get to you, and you can very easily mistake it, like feeling tired because you've done so much deity work versus something sort of sucking your energy out of you. It can be hard to identify that difference if you're new, and it might not even necessarily, like, there's also the flip side of that. It might not be a bad thing, like it might not be a bad entity, but misidentifying it and then working with that entity in the wrong way, not wrong as in like dangerous, but like you're not, like if it's a thing that wants offerings, you're not going to be able to give them the right offerings because you won't be able to research it properly. You won't be able to communicate with them in the way that they perhaps want or need. The folklore around them might be different. I don't like to push towards the fae, but like if it would happen to be an entity that could be classed as fae, how you work with the fae is going to be very, very different and much more advanced, I will say, versus deity work. Or if it's like a house spirit versus a deity, a house spirit's going to be very different. Your ancestors, like if your ancestors come in and you're like, it's a god, they're going to be like, yeah, definitely. So like it could be an entity, it could be good or bad, but being able to identify it properly is a big part of that process that novices aren't going to have the experience or the research behind them to be able to properly do.
Yeah, and all I can think about is when it, like, if it's, I know people who want to work with fairies, and I'm like, and they're not fairies. They're land spirits. Yeah.
Right.
I'm like, you don't want to work with, like, a Pisky or a Spriggan or a Knocker, which are a few of the ideas of, like, Cornish fae. But even then, moving forward, like, the fae aren't benevolent entities by nature. They don't want to be seen.
They're not looking to help you.
No, and like it's like one of those things too where even when we talk about land spirits of like indigenous land spirits of the US, like they don't really want to talk to you. Yep. Like you're not supposed to interact with them or even speak of them because they hate it.
Which you wouldn't know if you're a novice. If you haven't done the research, you wouldn't know that. And you could piss one off. So here's where I think it becomes like that line. If you misidentify something and it's not bad by nature, like it's not actively malicious, but it's something that doesn't want you to interact with it, it can easily become angry and agitated if you then are constantly trying to poke at it and being like, hey, be my friend, hey, you're my deity, right? And they're like, leave me alone, you weird kid. And then if they shove you away because they don't want to interact with you, you might mistake that as them being like a demon or a malevolent entity, and in reality, it's just a spirit that doesn't want your attention. It doesn't want to interact with you because, surprise, not everything's gonna want to interact with you, just like people. You know, that mistake is definitely gonna play a factor. Like, they're not all gonna want to just be your buddy, and misidentifying them is gonna make it so much harder, and I think this is why so many people are like, I have a demon in my house! You don't. It's just a spirit that doesn't want to talk to you. Most likely. I mean, there could be, but it's so low chance, generally, that something's gonna want to try to fuck with you that is that dangerous. It's probably just something else that you've annoyed.
I'm either going with spirit that doesn't want to interact with you or poltergeist, because poltergeists are surprisingly common, but they're usually mistaken as demons because they're just usually either minor, very, very minor lesser demons or spirits that just want to fuck around and, like, push things over. And I've had an experience with poltergeists. They're fun. They're a good time. But, I mean, like, even then, not every single spirit wants to help you. You need, like, even in saint work, you pay after it gets done. Like, you can venerate them, but, like, when I'm doing a novena, I say, this is what you get if this is completed. He doesn't get it if it's not completed, and that's how saint work works, because they're people. Like, with people, you have to, like, put the reward at the end in order for them to do things. There are also some
yeah. And often with deities, you kind of have to do it on both ends.
Yeah, some stories of people with saints also, like, beating them up like their statues, which I don't usually go. I don't usually go for.
That sounds risky.
You tie it up and put it underwater and stuff if it doesn't get done. Like, stuff like that. Like, and that's, like... I wish I was joking.
Bullying your saint.
Bullying saints!
Oh, gosh. Oh, God. I don't think I would ever have the confidence to do that because, like, as part of my heritage, I know that I could do saint work. Like, I could get into some of that. But, man, that's sort of the area where I'm like... I don't know. I know that, like, saints leads into, like, angels and archangels, and I'm just like, you know, I'd rather just stick over here to, like, I would rather, I know that this is actually a very common sentiment, and this is gonna be, like, super hard to process for people who don't fully understand it, especially, like, if there's any novices watching this. Advanced practitioners consistently will say, I would rather call on a demon than try to work with an archangel and, like, possibly fuck that up. They would rather do demon work, which can be dangerous in its own way, versus have an archangel mad at you, and, like, just angels in general. And that's a decent, like, entities in general, even if you think that they're, like, nice, and if media has conditioned you to think that they're super nice, maybe not.
I mean, and the thing is like, for a very long period, I'm like, I will never work with angels. And then I got into folk magic, and my ancestors were like, what'd you say?
Huh? Let's hear that again?
Tell you, because most people, like, identify this particular angel that I work with, like, the same way. Like, they feel the same, like, energy from him. And my friend was like, wow, he looks like this. And I'm like, really? I just see a bunch of fucking eyes. So I got the nice, like, scary, like...
Great.
Like, when I really tried to, quote-unquote, see him, it was not a person. It was, like, a golden light with, like, wings, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna look over here now.
Yeah, if you guys have never looked into, like, what angels are described as looking like in the Bible, it's, you should look it up, because there's awesome artist depictions out there, but two, it's usually, like, balls with 17 wings, and then there's just, like, wheels and eyes. Like, there's not a human body in the center of it. It's just this, like, eldritch horror blob thing full of whatever features they decide to come with today, and there's a reason that they say do not be afraid. They're interesting, and you got the fun version. Let's talk about misconceptions, and we've covered a couple already, but I think we should touch a little bit more on, like, the specific point that I think we should start with is that, like, going out for coffee with your deities thing, but just sort of misconceptions in general that you've seen a lot, and maybe, like, things that end up being your pet peeve, because I know that I've got a couple that I've spoken of here and there, but there's some that I just don't really talk about that much, but misconceptions and pet peeves I think would be fun.
I have to think about it a little bit, because genuinely, like, I just tuned it out at a certain point, because, like, if I saw things that upset me, I'm like, this person isn't hurting anyone, don't get involved, and I just am, like, started minding my business, which is part of the reason why I've garnered the attention that I have on TikTok, is because I never get involved with anything unless it's a danger to that person, or someone's life is threatened. So I've seen a lot of things, and I've been like, my pet peeve is people channeling messages for TikTok from their gods.
Ugh. Yeah.
And the only reason I say that as a pet peeve is because I mean, like, oracles and mediums are very rare because it takes a lot of energy. And I've only met one other medium, two other mediums, like me and my mom and my friend, that I'm, like, 100% like, yep, that's accurate. There's maybe another person too. But oracles are like I remember someone channeled Hades to give a message to TikTok.
I think I've seen this.
Why would they channel a message to put on the internet? And I just didn't understand it. And it was one of those things, too, where, like, so many people on the internet say they can do these things and do things like that, and then you never really know if it's true. And I don't...
Yeah, there's so many liars and grifters out there, and I don't know if we've seen the same person or not, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people doing this, but The comments were all super funny on it too, which is the only reason I ever look at any part of those videos. Is I'll like pause them as soon as I start cringing, and then I'll look at the comments, and all the comments were like, yeah, because Hades is gonna take over your body. Like it was a full body channeling that they were trying to say that was happening. So Hades is gonna take over your body. Pick up your cell phone, open to TikTok, hit the record button, and know how it works and be willing to do it, and then like do a super deep voice and be like, I am Hades. I am the Dark Lord of the Underworld. You fucked with this girl too long. You've done the wrong thing. She is mine, and you cannot hurt her. Like they usually use it to threaten, and it makes me want to die. It's so cringy. It's so cringy, and it's just like, yeah, because Hades is gonna channel you to threaten people, because that's how channeling works. Here's a hint for novices: that's not how channeling works. Deities aren't gonna channel into your body, full body, to threaten people on the internet.
The other thing is, I noticed another pet peeve is when mortals speak for the gods. Whether that be through like channeling or just saying, well, Thoya or Apollo, etc., told me this, and this is now the truth because I heard it from him and I can't be wrong. But without understanding that we misinterpret things from the divine all the time because we're literally interpreting what they're telling us, trying to understand it. And like, do you know how many times I misinterpreted messages from my deities for myself? Like like at least
about your
50.
own life when you have the full context.
And I'm like, ah! And then seeing people be like, well, this deity told me that this is incorrect. Like, I've seen people use that to say that this deity likes their name pronounced a different way than the ancient Greek way. Or that the mythos is actually wrong. And they are actually this. And it was like, okay, you cannot, like, if the deity was truly angry at the way they were being presented, don't you think they would handle it themselves?
And don't you think more people would be agreeing on this?
Yeah, why would they employ a mortal to do their business when they are a divine being? They do not need us to do things for them. And yes, when you're an oracle, a medium, a channeler, a high priestess, all of those things, you are employed in a way by the gods to get knowledge and wisdom and do all these things. But how many times are people on the internet saying their priestesses or oracles really that? We don't know. We can't tell. So it's really, I am very much at my own kind of discretion when that comes up because I don't totally know whether this person is actually a priestess or an oracle. With mediums, it's a little easier to tell because we all have shared experiences. Like that thing that you sent me the other day about the teeth, that's a shared experience. So that's how I know. I'm like, oh, this person's legit. Like, and that's one of those things, whereas like with mediums, there are shared experiences with spirit interactions that we can identify with each other. And like different, like, I guess you would call it like a shared personal gnosis. But when it's a priestess or an oracle and that's what just they call themselves, whether they're we don't know if they're initiated or not. We don't know the process for initiation. And priestesses are really hard to come by. These two things, like, I know someone who is an oracle that my mom is friends with, and she doesn't share it online because priestess, like, if you're a priestess or an oracle, sometimes it's really personal, especially if you're on the journey there. So I always kind of throw my nice skeptic attitude at it, which is part of the reason why people have been drawn to me is because I am a skeptic. I'm like, okay, let's think about this critically. Let's do research. Let's like really observe and think about this outside the box. And that's, I think, why people like me is I'm like, all right, let's look at this from the scientific perspective first.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who don't really question it. And the note about like priests and priestesses, I'm not gonna name any names because there's like 6 or 7 of them off the top of my head that I can think of just from TikTok alone. But there's a lot of people who will name themselves in their like username, priest or priestess. They'll claim that they are priests or priestesses of whatever deity. Usually it ends up being that they have self-proclaimed that they are a priestess, but they've only been working with that deity for like a year or so. There's no temple that they got their like priesthood from. There's no sort of official channel, and there doesn't always have to be, but most priests and priestesses that you're gonna find online, especially of pagan deities, because like the Christian church, there's like a process to become a priest. We don't really have that so much. So most of the time, if somebody's like, I'm a priestess of whoever, like I'm a priestess of Set or whoever, they're probably lying, and you should be really careful. A lot of these people just decide that they're priestesses, and then 14, 15-year-olds who don't know any better and are new to the space see the title priestess and go, oh, they must know so much, and then they'll watch a video of them saying the moon's gonna make you homicidal, and then you just get fear-mongered into shit, and it's not great. You should think very critically, not just of like your experiences with what you think is a deity, but also people claiming things about deities. Do a lot of research.
Throwing that shade in there, but she's also not the only person I've ever seen do that shit. She's not the first person to be like, the moon will make you want to kill.
The thing is like, we can look at like ER records of lunar full moons and know that there is some sort of reaction, but there hasn't been any scientific causation. It's a correlation currently. We literally have done studies on it, and there is nothing, because we have found like relations between animals and hormones and lunar illumination and like physiological responses in certain animals from the moon, and we have done these studies and we haven't found really any scientific evidence of what the moon does to humans. We know it affects them in some way, but we don't know. There's been no causation between ER and like homicidal thoughts and the full moon. We just know that it affects us somehow, but there's nothing that says that it's gonna make you crazy.
Yeah, well, in paganism, if it was gonna be that way, it would be that there would be more myths about lunar gods and goddesses causing madness, and we don't really have that, or them being like very angry things, so like the full moon. Like, we don't have that as much. It just makes things different. I'm gonna skip on to a new pet peeve misconception thing. I think we honestly need to talk about the getting coffee with your deity thing, because we see it a lot.
I will be like very upfront with this, because I'm the kind of person that I very much own up to my mistakes, and this specific person who talked about that, I gave them a pass. I told them it was okay, and I didn't doubt that experience, even though there were lots of other red flags in that situation. And, like, it wasn't even, like, it was, like, they said that, but I did kind of, there was a pass in that situation that I, like, gave that kind of entire situation. But I think the misconception here is that, like, people talk, that kind of gave way to the idea that, like, well, deities did all these things in the myths where they showed up and did, like, normal human things, so why wouldn't they adapt to technology in the modern day? But I really think that the way they adapt is different than everyone thinks. Like, they're not going to go to Starbucks and order a latte. They'll probably be they will be where they influence. So maybe you'd feel the presence of Athena at a university, or maybe you'd feel the presence of Floya, like at a protest, like, or like justice deities at a protest or in the courtroom. Like, you may feel them there because that's where they rule over. And it would be less of them actually manifesting and more of their spirit embodying the area. And I've definitely heard discussions of, like, deities being on the front of the lines at protests as of recently, which I don't doubt, but it's not like they manifested in true form and showed up. It's like they are looking over people and watching over them and being a part of it. And when, entities manifest in true form, when they do, we usually die by looking at them. If it's real, like, if it's fully them, you drop dead. Because they're divine energy. They're energy channels at the end of the day. And I think that conception is another kind of thing of, like, anthropomorphizing deities and entities to make them more human. and help us understand them more, which is great in the myths, which are metaphors, because that was, you know, us understanding deities and helping us understand our own consciousness and nature more. But it's, like, I'm not gonna, like, my deities will 100% tell me to drink water when I try to communicate with them if I haven't drank water all day, because they care, because I work with them. But I'm not gonna have, like, I have not ever had a situation where I was in a public place and I saw a full-on manifestation of a deity saying that they were gonna go try Starbucks.
Yeah, well, and even if we scale it back to the mundane sense, like, people try to say, well, they came down in the myths and did this and that. Look, they didn't come down in the myths to a human standing in the marketplace looking at jewelry and say, pick that one out, I like that. Like, that's what we're talking about. Like, in ancient times, that version is not what happened. And even, like, if we go with Starbucks as the common getting coffee with your deity thing is, it's not gonna be, Freya told me she wants the lavender latte. It's gonna be, like, if you ask for a sign, maybe, like, somebody buys you a coffee instead of you having to pay for it, or they, like, double make your drinks so you get two and your name is somehow on both, even though the orders are totally different. Like, weird stuff like that. Like, that's the only way I could think of it manifesting in Starbucks. Or, like, you know, you find $20 on the ground or something, just like little luck things that still could just be mundane.
A book falling off the shelf. Yeah. Like, stuff like that, where, like, you're looking for a book and a book with, like, Freya's name on it falls off a shelf. That's something I can see happening.
Yeah, but they're not gonna just to say, I want the lavender latte, you should buy it for me. Like, that's what we're talking about. There could be signs that happen, they happen to take place inside of a Starbucks because the situation is right to give you a sign there, but it's not gonna be, buy me this thing. It could be that, you know, we buy things for them, like if they like a certain color of candle, if they like certain scents, or like incense, or certain herbs, or whatever, or like there are certain offerings you can get them. You can bring those things home and offer them to them and see if they enjoy them more, but they're not going to be telling you what to buy because it's cute and pretty or whatever. Like, it's never going to be that level of mundane, because when they want you to do something, there's a purpose behind it. It's not just they think it's fun and they want to spend the day with you and be cutesy. Like, I hate to burst people's bubbles. They're not looking for friendship. They're not. People will mistake, like, they'll call them, like, motherly, or they're like your big sister, and they may have a maternal or paternal energy to them, or something like a very friendly energy. But they are not literally meant to be your mother. They're not literally meant to be your sister or your best friend. That's not their role. And trivializing them down to that level of, like, we're best friends and we go out shopping all the time. You're, like, number one, like, just to go back, you're either LARPing or you're not working with a deity. And I think it's dangerous to yourself to either lie about what you're doing to everyone and even possibly to yourself, and it's dangerous to not be able to properly identify because you're lonely. And I think that's where some of this comes from, is sort of this inherent loneliness of wanting a friend, wanting a pal, wanting to be, you know, accepted and loved and seen, just sort of at the end of the day. And it's part of why we push shadow work too, because shadow work would help you see that possibly you're making some of this up that gets more dramatic, or it's like stuff that just isn't what other practitioners routinely will say happens. So, like, shadow work is a big part of this process of understanding, am I actually going out to lunch with my deity every day and getting Starbucks with them, or am I really lonely and trying to make up for my loneliness? So we're gonna talk about God spousing and God shards.
And I think I want to make it clear too, I'm not making this to shit on anyone who God spouses, or anyone who has vehement belief about this stuff. That's not my intention. I just think it's important to have these types of conversations in the occult academic sphere. So God spousing is basically, I don't know the definition, but it literally is being the spouse of a god. And there are sometimes multiple God spouses for multiple entities, and you know, it is that idea that, like, God spouse is who you are. You were born to be that, and that's just your identity. Of the titles and research I have done on it is a very personal matter. People don't really share it that much, and it usually comes after a lifetime or a decent amount of years of devotion to a specific deity, is that you are asked to be a god spouse or you become the god spouse. And, you know, there is that idea of, like, you know, gods will take mortal spouses. That's not a weird thing. That's been around for a very long period of time. So there is historical backup to that. What is different is there is god spousing after working with the deity for a year, and god spousing after working with the deity and devoting things to them for 10 years. And a lot of historical texts, we do see those god spouses, it's like years of working with them, because it is literally like becoming a nun for them. You are theirs. You do not have a partner. You are theirs. So if you want to do that and that is your path, I respect the fuck out of you. Like, literally, I can't do that.
It's super hard.
And it's difficult, and I think a lot of people don't understand that, because they're like, well, I'm just like soulmates with my deity. And I'm like, you are literally becoming a nun at age 21.
Yeah. And I think nun is the best way to put it, because nuns will call themselves like married to Jesus. That's why they don't get married, they don't have sex. They have a husband, but they're not treating Jesus the way I would treat my partner, you know? They're not like saying, I love you, good night, Jesus, I can't wait to spend every day with you, let's go get coffee, let's go on dates. Like, if you couldn't think of a nun doing it, then you wouldn't be doing it with god spousing. That's the big thing. It's not a romantic relationship, and I think people fail to realize that, because, you know, we think of the word spouse and we think romantic marriage, and it's not what god spousing is at all. God spousing is a nun or a priesthood type devotion, and yeah, you've got it right on the head. It's like 10, 15, 20 years of devotion before you even think about it. You spend your entire life at the temple. You are doing that as your life's purpose. You will never marry, like not in the physical world. You'll never marry. You don't take partners. You are married to your god in more of the legal traditional sense. Like, think of how marriage used to be, where like women were property. You're property of that god now, essentially.
Divine servitude is what it is. It's divine servitude. You are in divine service to them.
Yeah, and I find that it's often teenagers or very, very early 20s. Like, I'm 25. I'm too young to be god spoused, in my personal opinion. I don't think that you can, unless you've literally been raised in it, and even then, only maybe by 25 would you be ready, if you were like from birth and they had chosen for you to like become the next, you know, whatever. Like, only then would it be a maybe, but like most people aren't going to be finding that. You're in all likelihood, unless you basically were raised in a cult, you're not going to have been raised in paganism or anything, or be raised to become, you know, the bride or husband of a god or goddess. And if you were raised for that, that's abuse, I'll just say. But like, people who are 13 or 14 or even 20, 21 claiming that they're married to this god, or usually it's the case that like, this god is my soulmate. That's really dangerous. And I think, like, on the one hand, you know, it always goes back to like LARPing or lying to themselves. Or, I'm gonna be honest, and I might upset some people by this, and I don't really care, it might be mental illness. And I think it's really important to sort of get yourself checked out. Like, it's not to be mean, but if you're looking to dedicate your life to this path, even if it's for the right reasons, and even if you have been working with this god or goddess for how many years, I think you should still get psych evals just to make sure you're in a healthy mind state to do that, because it does isolate you, and it's a big choice. But like, what we think of as god spousing, like a 13-year-old's not gonna be married to Hades. Hades isn't gonna leave Persephone to marry you. Like, you gotta understand that that's not how that works. And I think a lot of people sort of fool themselves from loneliness or mental illness or something, or from another entity trying to get you to bind yourself to them. You sort of get mixed up, and that's part of why it's not for beginners, is you have to like be able to identify them properly, be able to make sure for sure that it's not anything else, and you would banish any entities that are not meant to be that deity. You've worked with them long enough and gotten enough confirmations from other practitioners. Like, there's this long process, and then you have to work with them for like decades, and then maybe you get God spoused. They're not just gonna marry you because you're so beautiful. Like, it's not how it works.
I think the other thing we can talk about too is like God shards. And I think, because my information on this is a lot less than my information in my research on God spousing, because I was curious, mind you. The only information I can find on God shards is on Tumblr, which says a lot. Now, if I'm wrong, leave a comment on Nike's video with a source on God shards, and I will so gladly read it.
Yes, only with sources. If you guys are just coming in to say, well, that's not real, bring me your sources, because I will just ignore you otherwise. I'm serious. Like, you guys know how serious I am about, like, bring me your information, do your research. If you're just coming in with UPG, we don't want to hear it. If you have legitimate information, sourced, send it to us. We want to hear it. But if it's just your UPG, nah.
And, like, I'm not saying that I doubt that in some ways an essence of a god could be put into a mortal form, but there is no historical context for it. You can talk about demigods, where they were born and birthed of a god and a mortal, but they are not literally a piece of that god. They are part god. But even then, we don't see demigods happen a lot any days. Except, like, Percy Jackson. Ooh, shout out. But, like, I really did research this, and all I could find is stuff that led me back to Tumblr and Amino, which, by the way, Amino, not a reliable source. I'm sorry, but it isn't. So if you send me sources with Amino or a blog post referencing Amino, if the only information you can find on a topic is either from Tumblr, Amino, or even TikTok, that is not reliable. Immediately discount it. Because, like...
We're looking for, like, books and historical texts, academics, like, finding stuff on this, like, writings from the time, if writings are available, or, you know, in some cases it's Reconstructionist, so it's people centuries later writing about things that were part of that cultural tradition, but we need stuff that is, like, sources, not just some 13-year-old opened a Tumblr blog and said, this is what this means, like, sources. You guys know what I'm looking for.
I don't even think people realize that it's immediately grouped into otherkin.
Yeah. It's definitely like otherkin, and then it so often a lot of this sort of bleeds into I'm gonna venture to say dissociative disorders with like alters, because as a concept, dissociative identity disorder and like, you know, OSDD and stuff like that, there is the ability to create alters, not like by choice, but like alters that would pop up that are, there's like factives, fictives, so factives are like people that exist. You could have an alter that's Harry Styles. Fictive, you'd have like Sherlock Holmes. And so it would be possible to have an alter, like a mental, like separate personality alter, that is a god or goddess, but that does not mean that you have a god shard in you. It means that you have a dissociative disorder that creates alters, and like that's part of why checking in with your mental health and being realistic and like mundane versus the magical, you really need to be critical about it, because a dissociative disorder is really serious, and it, you know, were that to be the situation where you have a dissociative disorder and one of your alters is a god, that's gonna be really different than like whatever a god shard is supposed to be, which like, if we haven't defined it already, it's basically just like a piece of a god is in you. Not that you're the child of a god, but like part of Aphrodite is in you.
Even historically speaking, in the myths, if this was something that happened, we would have mythological stories about it. Or at least, like...
And we don't have any of that.
We don't. And, I mean, it's a rarely new construction. That all the information is new. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with new information. New information is great, but the new information is sourced from Tumblr. It's not sourced from someone studying a historical text and realizing, oh shit, this is what they were talking about, here's why. And that immediately turns me off to it as an academic and a skeptic. And I'm once again, I'm not making this or talking about this to bash these people or to say that it's not a valid experience. I'm saying that I automatically am very skeptical of it because of who I am as a person.
Yeah. And skepticism is really important. I think it's always good to have a little bit of skepticism about things, which is, we want you to question why, how, what, who, like, questioning it's always important so that you know that you're not making it up, that it's not UPG, that it's not some sort of delusion, because the human mind is really powerful and you can make yourself have experiences. Like, you can force hallucination completely sober, because like that, I don't know the ways to do it, and I'm not gonna try to instruct people how, but there are ways that you can just like make yourself hallucinate. The placebo effect is a thing. So there are ways that like the human mind can trick you into this stuff, which is why we encourage getting confirmations on things. We encourage like divination and like all these methods to like super, double, triple, quadruple, extra be sure that this is really what you're experiencing. And I kind of want to give now like a realistic look at what deity work actually looks like. And so I want to share like what you do for your daily deity work. I don't know if you're still doing deity work now, or if it's just saint work, but like if you're not, then what it used to look like, and I'll sort of talk about what some of mine looks like.
So I am still, because they are my patron gods, and my patron gods are the only deities that I work with at this time, I am still doing some semblance of deity work, not as intense as I used to, because I'm focusing primarily on saint work and reconnecting with my heritage, which is Italian folk magic. And so a lot of saint work, but on a good day, I would say that there is at least some semblance of prayer, whether that's meditative prayer or prayer to them in the morning, early morning, or kind of midday, and then saint work and praying to saints and praying for saints at night. I am almost out of candle wax in one of my candles, so I haven't lit them in a while, but usually these candles go early morning to midday, and then my saint candles go evening to night, when I do have access to a bunch of candles. And apart from that, offerings are continuous. Calling them in for spell work is continuous. I never call my saints and deities in on the same spell, because we don't like that clash. And what it used to look like was a lot of shadow work on the daily, a lot of astral projection, a lot of meditation. Although that's kind of been released a little bit, I am trying to meditate every day, whether it's through yoga or like sitting and really just going through it. And that, allows me to have an easier way of talking to them. And they still very much are around. I still feel their presence very frequently. Whether it's by just in mundane things or in magical things, they are very much around, and I still am kind of following their guidance on a lot of my studies. Even though there is a little bit of like retreat due to me working with saints, they're still there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and mine's pretty similar. I was telling Frankie before our recording, but I haven't been able to do deity work as much recently, and so I've sort of stepped away from that. And I still have their candles and everything. Like, I'm not just throwing deity work out the window, but I had like school was a mess and I was suffering mentally, and I'm in the middle of a move. We're actually going to pick up keys tomorrow relative to this recording, so like I'm about to move, and knowing that I was going to be moving soon for the last like 2 or 3 months, I chose to step away from it because it could have happened literally any day, and I didn't want to like disrupt that pattern to really get back into being serious about it. But my deity work is still, I try to honor them in the ways that they are meant to be honored. I am still doing research and reading on them, and so it's like little ways to sort of still be in that without necessarily doing daily stuff. I still try to do new moon offerings to Hecate, who's the main one that I work with. Aries and Aphrodite came for path work for a little while, so I still have their candles here. I don't know if they'll want to come back. I'm sure Aries certainly likes me with how I've been lately. I'm definitely still very vocal. Ooh, there's crows right outside my window. Sorry. That's interesting timing. Anyway, I'm still trying to like do things to honor them in spirit. I'm not able to do my fighting stuff right now, but when I am able to, I intend to further honor Athena and Aries through that, because it's a little bit of like strategic, but also just like base instinct fighting things. So for me, it's a lot of action-based things. in their regions, and for Athena especially, it's definitely like the intellectual work. And in a way, my studies with astrology are sort of in dedication to Hecate being, you know, things that are occult. But for me, it's a lot of like offerings. I'll do prayers. I got that big book of pagan prayers and rituals, so I'll go through that here and there and try to do some. But, you know, for me, it's actions, and I think people tend to forget that actions are a thing that you can offer to deities. So, you know, for Hades, some people will look after like stray dogs, or for Freya, they'll help take care of neighborhood stray cats. Some people will feed the birds, or they'll help deer, or, you know, there's like things for the animals that are associated with them. You know, deities of the marketplace, if you're trying to work on a business, you might try to work with them. Deities of like childbirth and children in general, you could like, you know, volunteer to work with kids. You know, there's actions you can take, and often we get so stuck in the like, I have to make an offering. What do I offer them? What do I give them? Like material things, when the reality is that your actions this is my UPG. I think actions speak much louder than offerings. Not to say you shouldn't do offerings in general, but I think actions will speak much louder to the gods because it's you showing in deed that you intend to follow their teachings, versus just, here's some stuff, I promise I follow you. You're showing that, no, I do actually believe in what I believe in, and I'm gonna do it.
Yeah, I devote most of my daily activities to a god. Depends on the day what I'm doing, but like my writing is for Nath because she is a god/goddess of creation and weaving, and so she's represented by spiders. And then, you know, Freya is god of lust, so that's kind of self-explanatory. But like Kronos is, you know, my time outside or walking or being in a cemetery. Most of my, you know, daily rituals or the things that I do on a daily basis are very much dedicated to my gods in one way or another.
Yeah, definitely. It's less exciting than I think a lot of people expect it to be. It's really just like, here's this offering, I'm gonna go do this thing, I'm gonna, you know, help my friends. It's not things that are gonna be like, I went on this epic journey and I scaled a mountain to leave an offering at the peak, and then I did a 3-week meditation on the mountain. Like it's not these epic journeys that we expect, are like, I'm doing this because my god has deemed it what I need to do, so I'm gonna go fight in this war. Like, it's not gonna be that most of the time. It's just your daily activities being devoted and living your life according to the sort of morals and lessons that they instill in you.
Yep, I agree.
And then we can move to advice if you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, my advice is not that much. My advice is really just research and really just understand kind of from other people's experiences. Like, spend a lot of time researching. You can devote your research to them. You devote your research about them to them. That shows that you're involved. Not everyone has a worshipping aspect before working with, but I usually recommend it. And I really think that if deity work as a novice is something you're interested in, you should take it seriously. Like, really research it and really understand it, and understand, you know, the pros and cons of it, etc.
Yeah, my advice is actually going to be do cultural research. So, especially like historically, I think it's important to look at all the aspects of the culture of the deities that you're looking into, because how the culture views those gods is going to really impact how you're supposed to read about their myths and about like the practices that go into it. Like, if you're looking into Norse gods, you have to understand the difference between like the men and women in Norse society and how that would impact the way that you view the gods. There's, you know, the classic stories of Odin, you know, trying to learn essentially the like women magic after already mastering the men magic, and so he had to humble himself before Freya, and like the social impact of what that means because of how gender roles were at the time. And so like, based on the gender roles, what his actions were, like, in order to be able to do that, what that meant as like an impactful statement. Same thing for the Greek gods, like what was Greek society like? I point to the Persephone and Hades myth, like the cultural thing surrounding that. Like, a lot of people are like, he kidnapped her, and there's like an assault aspect to it because the word, I don't know if I can say it on YouTube, the word for that myth originally did not mean assault. It meant to like take away or to capture. It was essentially like kidnapping, and there was a cultural thing where if the parents did not approve of a marriage, you were kidnapping the daughter, because, you know, women were property and that whole thing. And so it was not an assault thing, it was eloping. And so you have to be able to understand the cultural stuff. So cultural research, like, I know people don't like doing academic stuff, it's boring, art history, maybe you don't like it, but if you're gonna be serious about deity work, you have to do it. You have to do your cultural research, do your art history work, do academic stuff. Like, people get really mad when I suggest academic studies, but like, it's really important. Like, academics are the ones who study the cultural parts of it, and if you don't understand the cultural context behind how these gods are supposed to be viewed by their own people, you're never gonna be able to properly work with them. Yeah, so that's all I've got, unless you have anything else. Then how about we move into plugs? Frankie, where can everyone find you?
Everyone can find me Chaotic Witch on TikTok and YouTube, Chaotic Witch AU1 on Twitter, and Chaotic Witch 98 on Instagram. I post on TikTok every day, YouTube once a week. I do tarot readings up on my website, chaoticwitchon.com, and I think that's... Oh, and we have a Patreon, which is also just Chaotic Witch on Patreon. We have a Discord, we have a book club, I do mentorship at the highest tier, all this really fun, fantastic stuff. I post more information about that on Instagram, and I'm definitely the most active on TikTok and Instagram. So that's where to keep up with me and all that fun stuff.
And all of her stuff will be linked down below, so if you guys want to find her, you can just, you know, go in the description and stuff. You know me. Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, etc. My links are also in the description, and I have this cute graphic that comes up on screen now. I have a Patreon if you guys want to continue to support me financially, because that's really cool. My patrons are really awesome. I have a Discord server if you want to come hang out. I've also got special chats for my patrons, so you can just talk with me directly there, and we can, you know, have fun magic discussions. Otherwise, that's all I've got for you guys this week. I'll catch you next time, and blessed be! Yay!